Welcome to DEF CON 3. I'm KT McFarland. This week, world leaders all congregate on the United Nations in New York to talk about the issues that are a concern to them. One of the top items on everybody's agenda is ISIS. What do you do about ISIS? One of the things that has not happened to deal with ISIS and the looming threat of Islamic Jihad is United Nations action. So joining me now to talk about the likelihood of the United Nations doing anything, and even if they did, would it matter, is Robert O'Brien. He's a former U.S. representative to the United Nations. Thanks for joining us, Robert. What do you think? Will the United Nations take action beyond just maybe, I don't know, condemning violence? Will they actually go after ISIS?
It's a great question, KT. Good to be with you again. You know, the UN General Assembly this year ought to be a historic General Assembly because the UN was created at the close of World War II to stop the very type of aggression that we're seeing against member states right now. So you have a member state, Iraq, that's had a large portion of its territory taken over by this transnational terrorist group, ISIS. You have Israel, which has been attacked by a terrorist group, Hamas, from Gaza, and had 5,000 missiles launched at it recently at its civilians. And then in Europe, you have a European power for the first time since the end of World War II invading a neighbor and annexing its territory. So all three of these are examples of the type of aggression that the UN was developed to stop. I'm fearful that we won't see action on any of them.
Well, is there a mechanism by which the United Nations would discuss the threat that ISIS proposes in the Middle East, and also that Russia offers to Ukraine and potentially other countries in Europe?
Certainly, and they're part and parcel. I mean, ISIS ought to be an area where the entire international community gets together to defeat this organization. It's a particularly brutal terrorist organization. It has tentacles now because of all of the foreign fighters throughout Europe, the UK, the United States, certainly the former Soviet Union, Chechnya, Russia. So all of the members of the UN ought to get together and do something more than talk. And the forum for that, of course, would be the Security Council to have some sort of collective security response to ISIS. And hopefully that's something that will occur. I'm a little concerned that there's no momentum on that front, and I don't see the Security Council doing anything more at this point than perhaps a strongly worded demarche that ISIS will, of course, ignore.
Well, one of the things that is a direct threat to the United Nations is that there are UN peacekeeping forces on the Israeli-Syrian border, and that's the very place where ISIS is fighting on the Golan Heights. Is this something that threatens the United Nations, or will they just leave the area and leave the Israelis and ISIS to fight it out potentially?
That's a great question, KT. And of course, there was a very interesting development that took place a couple of weeks ago where fighters, at least affiliated with Islamist, perhaps not ISIS, took Fijian peacekeepers hostage. They tried to do the same thing to the Filipino peacekeepers who fought their way out, and it's now reported with the help of the Israelis who were directing fire from the Israeli side of the border to help the Philippine soldiers elude the Islamists and get to safety. Peacekeepers are sent in to when both parties agree that they want to have a neutral buffer between the warring sides so that they can enter into a truce or some sort of peace treaty. It's going to be very interesting to see. ISIL and the Islamists in Syria don't seem to be on the same page as at least the Syrian government used to be. I'm not sure if there's a role for UN peacekeepers on that border in Golan. I've been to that border. It may be that they have to get out and let the Israelis defend themselves from the threat. I see that as a very dangerous area for peacekeepers who probably will not be allowed to, under their rules of engagement, to fight the Islamists if they're surrounded or confronted.
Robert, one final question. ISIS now controls a good bit of Iraq, a good bit of Syria. It's larger than many countries already members of the United Nations. They have a viable and thriving economy. They have oil riches. Some have suggested maybe ISIS might join and be in a position, really, to join international organizations. What about the United Nations? Do you anticipate the Islamic State asking to be recognized and made a member of the United Nations?
You know, it wouldn't surprise me. They've certainly watched the Palestinian Authority, which has a long history of terrorism and a relationship with Hamas, seek and be granted entry into the UN. I think it's something that ISIL, as it believes itself to be a state, it believes itself to be the new caliphate. I could see it wanting entry into the UN, although unlike the Palestinian Authority, I don't see ISIL gaining support from other states in the Middle East, certainly not from Iran, certainly not from Saudi Arabia. So I don't see any pathway for ISIS to join the UN, but it wouldn't surprise me. They're very savvy politically. Their PR machine is very savvy. I could see them coming out and making that very argument that we control territory. We have our own language. We have our own ethnic group. We meet the criteria for being a nation state. We ought to be admitted to the UN. Now, of course, they'd have to agree to the UN Charter, not to invade their neighbors and that sort of thing. So, I don't think ultimately it would happen, but I could see them making a savvy PR play along those lines. So it's a super question.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Robert O'Brien, former United States representative at the United Nations. And I've got to tell you, what an irony if ISIS, which has tactics brought out from the Middle Ages of beheadings and crucifixions and executions, were somehow to be taken seriously as a candidate for the United Nations, an organization created to keep world peace. That's it for DEF CON 3. Thanks for joining us.